Good morning. Thank you again, Tim, for joining us.
Glad
Um,
to be here.
I'm Christina with Ask a Montessorian. Um, Tim Seldin is a member of the Montessori community. He has been for probably as long as my mom has, at least. And he is the um, founder of the Center for Guided Montessori Studies. And he is he was a big participant with the American Montessori Society and how it came to be. And I'll let you tell me a little bit more about your experience with Montessori.
Sure. Well, first off, I'm one of four founders of the Center for Guided Montessori Studies, and really having helped start it, I'm still involved, but it's not my day job. There's a terrific team there, including my son Mark, who's the administrative director, and my partner Kitty Bravo, who is the educational director, and there's a team of more than 50 teacher trainers that are involved in the programs from infant toddler through high school and the administrative program. My day job is I'm the president of the Montessori Foundation, which is essentially a nonprofit school support system, a consulting group, think tank. We do all sorts of things to help boards, owners, leaders of schools get through either the process of a school being born or a public school developing a new public school, everything other than teacher training. So we speak with parents. We do a lot with parents under our Montessori Family Alliance. We work with school leaders under our services of the Montessori Leadership Institute and our consulting. And it grew into a membership organization similar to AMS and AMI that offers school accreditation and teacher education called the International Montessori Council. And our fundamental principle is that Montessorians ought to work together, that this tribalism of are you AMS or AMI or your training is less than my training to us is really unneeded and unproductive. We all are on a journey. We all have things to share. We're all learning constantly and we're better together. So part of our work is to recognize that there are people who very strongly identify with one group or the other. We honor that, we respect it. As you mentioned, Christina, I was my own training is to the American Montessori Society. I was on their board. I was one of the leaders for many, many years. And I ran two of their teacher training centers. But today, my role for the last really 30 years has been to celebrate them and to provide an independent voice wherever we can do good. Part of that has been the creation of this third organization, which pioneers innovative solutions for teacher training, very much like your mom did with her taking training to the schools. We do innovation of our own, which is we were among the pioneers of using high fidelity, high quality online learning to do much of the teacher training and still be fully accredited, and to not have the limitation of those precious days that people are willing to give up and go to a teacher training program, whether it's at their school or in another city. So having run those kinds of programs, we realized we were always at a loss for time, and that after a few weeks, people's ability to learn really began to fall off quickly. And while they continue to learn from many things that come into training, they may know a lot, they continue to learn from the children, their colleagues, their readings. We feel training can be best done when you really blend the year of student teaching and 2 or 3 if you need it. So we don't just give a credential because you put in your time. We're really looking for you to show that you understand and can do it. The theory and lecture and presentations, and then the thoughtful discussion and the evidence, you really understand that you really can do all the different things, and see Montessori in the historical and social context of how the movement began, how it developed here in the United States. And since we're global, we really don't just look at it from an American perspective. We try to help people to know the history of Montessori where they live, as well as understanding its origins in Europe and then later in India, and then as it spread out, and the fact that America really was a source of a renaissance of Montessori and has influenced the movement in ways that are uniquely American as well.
Can you tell me which training levels you have at CGMS?
Really, all of them, from infant, toddler, early childhood, elementary, either as 6 to 9, 9 to 12, or 6 to 12, which is what we recommend. Then we have 12 to 18, or adolescent education, and it is a full scale, fully accredited, not an orientation, but a really deep training program. And then we have a leadership credential course, which is just now going through the MACD accreditation process. As you may know, they just recently got approval from the United States Department of Ed to accredit administrator trainings. In the meantime, the Montessori Foundation has for 30 years done non-accredited, non-credentialing professional training for school leaders and boards. And we do all sorts of things for professional development for teachers that, again, is just, it's either done on site or it's done online, often live. Like tonight, I'll be speaking to a group from Canada, a group of parents for a couple of hours, and I'll be doing a 2-hour session tomorrow with the teachers of that school. But we send people to schools, we do it online, just as you're interviewing me.
How did you guys approach the pandemic with CGMS, and has it gotten back to normal again, like for the 1 to 3 years of, student teaching and observations and all of that?
Well, when the pandemic hit, every teacher training program in the world was forced to either shut down or create some kind of blended training. So we've been doing the blended training for 16 years. So our people were used to it. They had already figured out how to do it well, and we had all the resources and the infrastructure in place. In the same way, our lab school, which is the Newgate School in Sarasota, it seamlessly went online. Now, what we all know is infants, toddlers, early childhood, even elementary, they don't really sit there and stare at a computer screen. And even our adolescents, which we continue to have what Newgate calls a global campus. And CGMS, by the way, has a new online only secondary program called the Bridgemont School. All of these are, I think, very successful, rigorous, high fidelity Montessori programs, even though they're being done at a distance. Adolescents respond well. With elementary children, it really works best when there's a parent there, or they're in some sort of local cohort and they're just getting certain kinds of support and lessons from an online resource. So we definitely can support homeschooling parents and pods of groups, but that's, generally speaking, that's an area that I don't think any of us have, in my opinion, really figured out how to do well, especially with infants, toddlers, and early childhood. But there are a lot of people out there offering programs and services, from Monty Kids, as you may know, which sends a box of equipment to people every 3 months on subscription, to any number of online Montessori educators who are trying to figure out how to support homeschoolers. I think that that's a fascinating area, and we're quite intrigued by it. We're trying to understand what works, what doesn't work, what other people are doing. And I'd say we're we consider everyone a babe in the woods when it comes to that.
I hear you. You've published several books, Tim. Yeah.
More than 10, as I recall.
Oh my
Probably,
goodness.
probably a handful are the best known. The Montessori Way, which at the moment is out of print. We're selling only digital ebook versions until we can update it. That one is the coffee table, sort of a text of Montessori for somebody who really doesn't know Montessori. And what I love about that book, especially in teacher training as kind of a first introduction, is it's just like we do in Montessori lessons. It's a big view of the whole with lots of illustration, hundreds and hundreds of color illustrations, as well as text that is not in Maria Montessori's original translated language, so that it's more easily digested. And yet we're really trying to talk about the many faces of Montessori at each of the age levels, and what does a college student, a graduate student, a person in teacher training, what do they need to know in the biggest possible terms, so that then they can begin to go in and look deeper. And it's really good for a parent. A lot of parents have it. And again, it's a coffee table book, pretty heavy. Nothing else like it. And then Montessori for Every Family is the one that just came out. That one was designed to talk about Montessori family life, not homeschooling, not how Montessori works in the classroom, not even whether you have a child in Montessori. It's like, how does Montessori apply to your marriage, to your parenting, to working together as parenting partners, to family life, whether it's an infant through a kid getting ready to go to university. And then How to Raise an Amazing Child is really more of the how to set up the home environment for a child under the age of 6. And it really talks more about specific things you can do. But again, it's not a homeschooling book. And then finally, Montessori 101, which is a title that a lot of other people have sort of grabbed onto. And there's a website called Montessori 101. But that is, again, a highly condensed 80-page, hundreds of photographs, meant for a parent in a Montessori school to understand what Montessori is like. Very similar in some ways to that wonderful book that Aileen Wolf did back in the 60s or 70s, The Parent's Guide to the Classroom, except this one is it's full color, many more illustrations, much more text, and it goes really kind of does an overview fully through elementary, and then sketches out what you're probably going to see in a high school. And it covers Montessori philosophy as well.
Do you have any current projects that you're working on?
Mm-hmm.
You kind of
lots of them. I'm working on 3 books. One is on Montessori boards, another is on Montessori high schools, and another is a rewrite, some new version of the Montessori Way, which I did with Dr. Paul Epstein. There's a 4th book we're talking about early childhood science, more oriented to the area of botany and zoology and gardening. And then I'm on the board of a university that always was involved with Montessori, but is partnering with the Foundation and the Center for Guided Montessori Studies to become a true Montessori university. To not just, we're not interested in training teachers. We're much more interested in giving bachelor completions and master's degrees and eventually a doctorate in Montessori for people who have taken Montessori training. So that's really been interesting, because we're asking, what does the 4th plane of development really look like? How do you deal with adult learners in a Montessori fashion? And we're really, that's a big project. And then we're really working to take what began as a parents magazine that you may have seen over the years, Tomorrow's Child, which is now 30 years old, and developed that into a parents network or movement, which we call the Montessori Family Alliance. And we're doing a bunch of things. We're trying to go from print to many more resources that are curated online, discussion groups, classes, parenting education that is Montessori specific for how to deal with your child, how to deal with situations, how to homeschool, really in a support system where parents are both able to talk to us and talk to each other. And ideally, what it'll lead to is a network of alliances within the schools and then within a city so that the families of greater Dallas-Fort Worth, for example, might have a whole network, just as we would set up a teachers and leaders of schools network. The goal is to turn parents into more partners instead of customers.
I love that. That's a great.
Those are a few of our projects.
That's wonderful. What quality about yourself stands out the most that you can credit your success to?
Well, my family started school in 1932, and I went there from age 1 through the 12th grade. I just I swore I wouldn't get involved with it and found myself doing it. That's happened to a couple of my kids, not with the school, but with Montessori, although one of them, Dr. Robin Howe, was very involved with the school for 13 years. And we ran him through training from age 3 through 12th grade. And then he served as my co-head of school for 6 years. And he's really great. He's senior consultant today. I don't know, I guess when my mom died, I knew I loved what the school stood for. I knew that it wasn't like any other Montessori school we had ever seen on many levels, and much larger, went through high school, had a lot of land, had horses and woods and lakes and things like that. It was in Washington, D.C., which kind of makes it unusual in itself. And it was old, and it was older than most of the Montessori schools around. And I guess when she died, I just approached it with humility because I knew what I loved, but I didn't know how my mother wove the magic. And there were all these teachers who were, my mother's age or older. And we realized we needed to capture the wisdom of how things worked, what made the magic, and systematize it, and then figure out a way to build from there and try to make it even easier so that if something happened to me, it wasn't just in my head as it had been in my mother's head. So that is what really led to, first off, the continuation of Berry, which is celebrating its 90th anniversary this year, and to the creation of the Montessori Foundation, which is really a carrying forth of what made Berry work and so incredibly magical. Not because, Washington, D.C. is not Montessori friendly territory. And if you think about it, that was, the headquarters in those years of the American branch of AMI. We were an AMS school. There were 114 Montessori schools. We were just one. And we had our own voice. It's part of what led us to really recognize that there's wisdom in every corner of Montessori. You aren't better because you're bigger or older or from one camp or another. And that's really part of what led to it. It's how do you bring in the right families who will love you for what you are and will appreciate you instead of what have you done for me? And why should I continue to be involved with you, whether you're a publicly funded school or a privately funded school? Parents are always asking, is this weird, non-traditional thing as good as it gets, or maybe there's something better? And the answer is, of course, beauty is in the eye of the beholder. We would argue that a Montessori child can never be replaced. And by that, what we mean is not that if a child leaves, you can't ever fill their seat, but rather that when children grow up together and someone leaves, it tears a hole in the fabric of the community. And same with their family. If the family was not a customer, but was really in relationship with other families, their departure is not casual. It really destabilizes the class, the school community. And since you can't make people stay, the only thing you can do is try to figure out who is it that you really want to be, and then try to go from the fantasy or the rhetoric to reality so that day after day, from class to class and level to level, that's what people are experiencing, so they can count on it. And then try to find families, not only who want to come to your school, but who will value it and be your partners and are likely to stay. And then having found the perfect match together, as opposed to, I know better than you do whether you should be in this school. It's a two-way thing, like a marriage. When you get married, that's the beginning of the hard work. So really, that's what we teach the school leaders and the boards is you can't simply say, well, my parents want something different, so we're going to change. You've got to find the families that want what you're able to provide well and consistently.
That brings me to, we just had Valentine's Day. So I would love to ask you about how you met Joyce.
Well, I met Joyce, gosh, it must have been about 37, maybe 38 years. No, is it long? Yeah, it's not that long ago. She came in with her ex-husband. They were two professional parents, really wonderful people. They had these two little kids, and they seemed like the perfect match. The way Joyce tells the story, she liked what she saw, but the big deal was she really wanted to get back to work. She had these two little kids, and we were willing to take Robin, who at that point was 2.5, and no one else would take him. We were willing to take him and take him mid-year. And they were parents in our schools for years and years, and somewhere along the line, that relationship had drifted apart, and Joyce and I discovered we were really best of friends, and somehow best of friends became a new family. So I've got kids of my own with my ex-wife, and then I have the children I married into, who I helped to raise, and we're all best friends. Her ex-husband is a dear friend of mine, was part of our wedding. I mean, that kind of thing.
Wow. Now, did all of your children go through Montessori?
Yes, up to a certain point. I don't think any of them went through high school. As I recall, they went through 8th grade and then went on to various other private or public schools, and mostly private.
Do you know anything about the high schools here in the United States? I know
Yeah,
that
I'm
far into
supposed to be
the
one.
economy.
I'm supposed to be one of the people who started the movement, because our family started the Montessori High School at Barry back in the 40s, and that's where I went. So back in the 70s, I was with David Kahn and Phil Gang and John McNamara and John Long, and a lot of really interesting people when we sort of evolved the idea of Montessori adolescent education. So yes, I know not every school, but I certainly know a lot about it.
Okay. So, what is one of your favorite books?
Oh, I don't have a favorite book. I've got to say I've got a few books I particularly cherish, other than Maria Montessori. Um, I am very fond of the work of Dr. Rianne Eisler. Her book, Tomorrow's Children, in particular, has been helpful to me in thinking about Montessori. And again, similar to the work of Buckminster Fuller and Ashley Montague and Brian Schwinn and other sort of meta thinkers, meta historians, as they would usually call themselves. I really like her books, The Chalice and the Blade and The Real Wealth of Nations and so forth. They're all favorites. There's also a new book that I've just finished that I'm very, very impressed by. It doesn't look like much. It's going to come out on March 8th. It's an English translation of an Italian book about the life of Maria Montessori, told by a non-parent and a non-educator who is a journalist and a researcher. And she simply, as an Italian, wanted to know who was this woman, Maria Montessori, who most Italians know the name, but they don't know much about her. And she wanted to really dig below the surface and try to understand what was her life really like. And she got access to the family and to the records and could read all the languages and went back to the original source material, which still exists. And she spent 5 years researching and very carefully preserving the confidentiality of her sources. She has reminded me she's a journalist, and that's what makes journalism work, is you never reveal your source unless they want to be revealed. So she's written a book which is very, very well documented, but it tells the life of Maria Montessori through a very different lens than most of us in Montessori have seen before. Very different from Rita Kramer, very different from E.M. Standing. And she accredits those books as being very good, but very different than her book. So a way of understanding it is she looks at Maria Montessori, the person, as well as Maria Montessori's facts below the myth, and tries to understand who she really was as best as anyone can.
What was one of the characteristics that stood out for you that you learned about Maria that you didn't know before?
I always had the impression that when Mario was born, her son, that he was sent off to relatives of Maria's in the country, and she would go and visit him, but never identify herself. Several things about that turned out not to be true. First off, Maria Montessori, as you know, I suspect, was a feminist and very involved with women's rights issues. She was also a progressive, and part of what that meant in those days was the idea of women having legal equality and marriage not creating a sense of being owned by a husband. In those days, as an Italian woman, she could not inherit property or have an account in her own name. A man had to do things for her. And as you may know, she was one of the people who began to get those laws changed and really advocated for that. Anyway, when she was younger and was involved with Mario's father, that was not a short-term relationship. It lasted for quite a while. They didn't get married because they didn't believe in marriage. The father, turns out, Giuseppe Montesano, was a Jewish fellow from a family that was a secular, non-practicing Jews. And that was one of the reasons why they didn't get married, because his family said, no, this is too hard. The child actually was raised by his father. And Maria, I don't know whether she wasn't allowed to see him or chose not to see him, but until he was 15, she stayed away from him. And he apparently had a very normal childhood, other than knowing there's his missing mother. And he was in boarding school when she finally approached him. She wrote him a letter and said, "I'm your mother, and I'd love to meet you." And at age 15, she drove to his boarding school and she met him. And I think the two of them ran away together.
Oh, wow.
That's just one little tidbit I didn't know.
That's amazing. So what advice would you give to Montessori teachers? I have a lot of friends in the community who were shocked during the pandemic and their schools have changed or closed down, if they don't have access to a Montessori school, what would you suggest they do?
Well, I think there's several things that people can do. Um, let's talk within education first. And how are you doing on time?
Let me look. I think we're okay.
Okay. So the first thing is they can, I think the truth is there's a desperate shortage of teachers. And if you've got friends that don't have a job, I'm really surprised. There are only a few communities in the United States where there isn't a desperate search for Montessori teachers. Now, what may be going on is a school that they knew is no longer open or doesn't have as an enrollment big enough at this point to take them in. But my impression is that so many non-Montessori schools closed that, and parents are returning to work, there's a desperate desire to get children into early childhood programs, as well as many, many families who have gone from the normal neighborhood public school and have gone to either private schools or to charter schools or to schools where they think the program will be different from what they would normally experience for one reason or another. Those schools are hiring, and I'd be really surprised if a Montessori teacher couldn't get a job. If they can't get a job, have them email me, because I probably know plenty of schools that are looking for people. The second is they can always go to Indeed or ZipRecruiter and list themselves as being available. If someone is willing to move from the home they're in now, not a problem, because all over the world there are Montessori jobs. Right here in the United States is a desperate shortage. Next thing is many of these teachers that I know, when the pandemic came along, if their school didn't continue to employ them, they basically set up some kind of online service and basically a little home business that they created where they're sort of promoting Montessori and trying to help parents who are keeping their kids at home for one reason or another. Either the sense that the schools are so political these days, or their fear of the pandemic, or whatever is going on, the feeling that they want something different. And I think that there are certainly a fair number of people that I've seen who are doing that. And then the next is they get together and start a new school. And I mean, I have never seen so many people approach me for assistance in creating new schools. I'm probably working with 100 right now. And it's not as hard as people think, but obviously it takes money, it takes patience, it takes some business savvy. But generally speaking, if someone really wanted to do it, this would be a great time to do it.
Nice.
Now, outside of Montessori, I've seen people go from Montessori to medicine, to psychology, to social work, to school consulting, to the local public schools, to tutoring centers. I always wondered why there wasn't a Montessori math or a Montessori reading center similar to Kuman and these other after-school programs using Montessori strategies and materials.
My mom and I
To me,
talked about that.
yeah,
It's a
to
great
me, you could use Montessori to teach. You can use it for mediation. You can use it for supplement and acceleration. And if there's anything a Montessori teacher ought to know how to do, it's how to tutor.
Exactly. What is one of your favorite quotes?
Oh, clarity is the key to success. I'm probably best known for that silly quote. The idea is that Montessori means so many things to different people that we're often not even talking the same language, or we argue about stupid stuff. And within an individual school, as Dr. Nancy McCormick Rambush used to say, it often looks like you're in a shopping center with every individual classroom its own independent business doing its own thing. We believe that a great school knows who it is, knows what it's trying to be, and is really working hard so that they're walking their talk and delivering a consistent experience, whatever that might be. It could be a polylingual Montessori school. It could be a organic gardening or nature-focused Montessori school. It could be pretty much anything from a boutique to a multi-thousand student school. We just argue that the secret of success as a teacher or as a leader or as an institution is to really be clear, consistent, and have integrity, to be serious about delivering every day what you say you're delivering.
That makes sense. I just finished my elementary training with Greg McDonald, and we talked
Mhm.
about open classrooms, open schools, and the idea of archways where the toddlers can go in with the elementary children and the high schoolers can go in with the toddlers, and they all just kind of blend together. And it's a beautiful theory.
Yeah, it is. It doesn't always work as easily as that. Usually it's more the idea of having them in enough proximity that you're deliberately having older students entering without disrupting, and you don't want toddlers meandering through the building. Uh, there are legal liability issues.
Right.
And not every parent wants a teenager with, you know, their little child on their lap. Um, so you got to watch out for a lot of different issues. But the concept of a school as a community of all the children, rather than this is my classroom. Don't you, one of the basic principles, as I've always understood it, is that we engineer an environment, but once we've engineered it, our job is to help the children learn to not only navigate it, but to recreate it and sustain it, to take as much ownership of it as they can, which is why I really like Brianne Eisler's theory of partnership and the partnership way. I think it's another better way of thinking about curriculum and some of the meta narratives that we try to teach in Montessori, such as social justice and no one-upsmanship and no need to compare and compete. And if the children want to compete, that let it come from them, and teach them how to be nice about it instead of rubbing a child's nose in it and using blame and shame. So I think that the best thing about Montessori schools when they're done well is that the school is collectively like a small town, a community. And there's a real sense of citizenship and pride as opposed to a transactional, I pay you money, or I got in here and my tax dollars obligate you to make me happy and meet my child's needs, which is very transactional and can be very adversarial. I really believe in more the Nordic tradition of we're all here with the child in the center, and our goal is to figure out how can we best work together in partnership and mutual respect, not to mold the child, but to help the child find her own voice. So that's in my mind the best thing about sending a kid to Montessori. Ideally, is that you are part of an enduring community that enriches your life as an adult, whether you're a teacher or an assistant or administrator or a parent. You're part of a family.
That brings me to Montessori with adults. You touched on it a little bit with the foundation. Um, there's a senior home here in Flagstaff where they're working with the Alzheimer's patients. Do you?
Yes, that's the work of Dr. Cameron Camp, and there's another colleague that I know of who's out of Harvard, both of whom are sort of independently doing certification and professional development for these memory care units for stage 1 to stage 2 dementia. And it's well documented, well researched, and pretty well developed, and it's global. So while there's not one voice that has, the one center, it's more like what's going on with Montessori bloggers and the bloggers like yourself. Anyone that feels they have something to add, they just jump in. But there is an ongoing movement that has been happening for at least 25 years that I know of, that has been really aggressively looking at this from a medical and neuropsychological and healthcare institution perspective, and the very deliberate training of adults to do it. I know that Dr. Cameron Camp is looking at trying to create a formal training and certification for Montessori. We call it elder care. And I don't know where that project stands at the moment, but his goal was to get MACD to recognize a credential for that. And I think the biggest challenge in most of these memory care units is that the staff that directs the programs is not necessarily, they're trained in nursing, but they may be more mobile, and you may have a program suddenly dissolve because they got a better offer elsewhere. And so I think they're just trying to figure out, how do we make it a lasting, enduring program?
Nice. Is there anything else you would like to share with us today?
Great believer in having animals around the classroom. Maltese are hypoallergenic. While there are some children who are sensitive even to hypoallergenic dogs and cats, generally speaking, it'll work for a lot of them. And there are many breeds that work well. And I'm a great believer in children having access not only to each other and loving adults, but taking care of living things, hopefully farm animals, but in the classroom, some sort of animal that doesn't trigger allergies and doesn't hurt anybody.
Nice. Well, thank you so much, Tim. I really appreciate your time.
It's been my pleasure. Please give your mother, Sandy, my regards, and congratulations on completing your elementary training.
Oh, thank you, sir. Give me just 1 second.